The wind howled like a demon through the mountain pass, and Maeve Callahan pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she watched the sky turn from gray to black in the span of a single breath. She had heard stories about winter storms in the Rockies, but nothing could have prepared her for the wall of white that suddenly descended upon their wagon train like the hand of an angry god, transforming the world into a frozen nightmare that would test every soul trapped within its merciless grip. It was late November 1876, and their wagon train had been making steady progress from Independence, Missouri, toward the gold fields of California. 23 wagons stretched along the trail, carrying families full of hope and dreams, their supplies carefully rationed for the long journey ahead. They had planned to make it through the mountain pass before the worst of winter set in, but nature had other plans. The storm came without warning, sweeping down from the peaks with a fury that turned day into night and froze the breath in their lungs. Maeve was 21 years old, traveling alone after her father had died of fever 3 weeks into the journey. She had no family waiting for her in California, no husband to protect her, just a fierce determination to reach the coast and start a new life away from the poverty and pain that had marked her years in Missouri. Her wagon was small, pulled by 2 aging oxen, and her supplies were meager compared to the other families. But she had her father's rifle, her mother's Bible, and enough stubborn pride to keep moving forward even when every logical voice told her to turn back. The first day of the blizzard, everyone thought it would pass by morning. They circled the wagons tight, built fires that the wind immediately tried to extinguish, and huddled in their canvas-covered homes while the snow fell in thick sheets. But morning came and the storm only intensified. The second day was worse. The third day, people started to worry. By the end of the first week, worry had turned to fear. Zachariah Turner was a cowboy hired by the wagon master to help scout the trail and keep the livestock from wandering. At 26 years old, he had spent most of his adult life on horseback, drifting from ranch to ranch across the territories, never staying long enough to put down roots. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He rarely spoke unless necessary, and the families on the wagon train knew him only as a quiet, competent presence who could track a lost cow in the dark and fix a broken wheel with whatever materials were at hand. Zachariah had noticed Maeve Callahan from the first day of the journey. It was hard not to notice her, the way she handled her own wagon with such determined grace, the way she never complained even when the trail got rough. After her father died, he had expected her to turn back or throw herself on the mercy of one of the families, but she had done neither. She buried her father with her own hands, spoke a few words over the grave, and climbed back onto her wagon seat with dry eyes and a set jaw. Something about that strength called to him in a way he could not quite name. During the first week of the storm, Zachariah moved between the wagons, checking on families, helping to dig out snow that threatened to collapse canvas covers, and rationing out feed for the animals. The livestock were suffering worst of all, standing in the open with ice forming on their hides, their feed running dangerously low. Several oxen had already died, and the horses were growing weak. If the storm did not break soon, they would lose more than animals. Maeve spent those first days like everyone else, staying inside her wagon as much as possible, only venturing out to tend to her oxen and gather snow to melt for water. She had flour, beans, salt pork, and 2 loaves of bread she had baked just before the storm hit. It was not much, but she was used to making do with little. She measured out her portions carefully, eating just enough to keep her strength up, knowing that every bite she took now was one less bite for later. On the 8th day, the wagon master, a grizzled man named Henry Polk, called a meeting during a brief lull in the wind. Everyone who could walk gathered in the center of the circled wagons, their faces pinched with cold and hunger. Polk did not mince words. Their supplies were running critically low. The livestock were dying. If the storm did not break within the next few days, they would have to start making hard choices about who got to eat and who did not. A woman named Sarah Brennan started to cry, her 3 small children clinging to her skirts. Her husband put his arm around her shoulders, but his own face was gray with worry. Other families exchanged frightened glances. An old man named Thomas Whitfield suggested they try to push forward, to move through the storm, but Polk shook his head. The snow was too deep. Visibility was near zero, and they would lose people in minutes if they tried to travel in these conditions. Their only choice was to wait it out and pray. That night, Maeve lay in her wagon listening to the wind scream and thought about her father. He had been a good man, her father. A farmer who never quite managed to make the land pay, but who always made sure his family had enough to eat. Her mother had died giving birth to a stillborn son when Maeve was 15, and after that it had been just the two of them, struggling through each season, holding on to hope that next year would be better. When he got the fever on the trail, he had made her promise not to give up, not to turn back. She had held his hand as he died and sworn she would keep going. But now, trapped in this frozen hell, she wondered if keeping that promise meant she would die out here too. The second week brought no relief. The storm raged on with a relentless fury that seemed almost personal. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in minutes. Fires became nearly impossible to maintain. People stopped venturing out except when absolutely necessary. The wagon circle became a collection of isolated islands, each family alone with their fear and their dwindling supplies. Zachariah continued his rounds, though it grew more difficult each day. He checked on the livestock first, his heart sinking when he found 2 more oxen dead, frozen where they stood. The horses were barely hanging on. His own mount, a tough Mustang named Smoke, was showing signs of weakness despite the extra feed Zachariah slipped him from his own rations. He moved from wagon to wagon, asking after the families, assessing their conditions. What he found was grim. Almost everyone was running low on food. Some families had already exhausted their supplies and were relying on the charity of others. But charity only went so far when everyone was starving. When he reached Maeve Callahan's wagon, he found her outside trying to chip ice off her oxen's water bucket. Her hands were bare, her fingers red and raw with cold. She looked up when his shadow fell across her, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the hollow look that came from too many days with too little food. "You need gloves," he said, the first words he had spoken to her in days. "I need a lot of things," she replied, her voice steady despite the cold. "Gloves are not at the top of the list." He pulled his own gloves off and held them out to her. She looked at them for a long moment, then shook her head. "I cannot take your gloves. You need them as much as I do." "I have another pair in my saddlebag," he lied. He did not, but his hands were tougher than hers, more accustomed to the cold. She hesitated, then took the gloves with a small nod of thanks. Her fingers brushed his as she did, and he felt the ice cold of her skin even through that brief contact. It troubled him more than he wanted to admit. "How are your supplies?" he asked, though he had a feeling he knew the answer. "Fine," she said, turning back to her bucket. Another lie, and they both knew it. He wanted to press her to demand the truth, but he knew pride when he saw it. She would not accept help easily, this one. So instead he just nodded and moved on to the next wagon, though his thoughts stayed with her long after. The 14th day of the storm broke something in the wagon train. A man named Robert Crawford, half mad with hunger and cold, tried to steal food from another family's wagon. He was caught and beaten by the other men, and Polk had to intervene to keep them from killing him. Crawford's wife begged for mercy, and eventually they let him go with a warning, but the incident left everyone shaken. They were turning on each other now, civilization stripped away by desperation. It would only get worse. That night, Maeve sat in her wagon and looked at her remaining supplies. One loaf of bread. That was all she had left. She had been stretching her flour as far as it would go, but she had used the last of it 3 days ago. The salt pork was gone, the beans were gone. Just one loaf of bread, and she had no idea how many more days or weeks they would be trapped here. She thought about eating it all at once, about filling her belly for the first time in days. But then she thought about Sarah Brennan's children, about their thin faces and hollow eyes. She thought about old Thomas Whitfield, who had given her advice about her oxen back when her father was still alive. She thought about all the people in this wagon train who had shown her small kindnesses along the way, who had not shunned her when she was left alone. The decision came easier than she expected. She wrapped the loaf in a clean cloth, pulled on Zachariah's borrowed gloves, and stepped out into the howling wind. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. Snow stung her face as she made her way from wagon to wagon, knocking on canvas covers, calling out names. One by one, people emerged, confused and frightened by the late visit. When they were all gathered, shivering in the center of the circle, Maeve unwrapped the loaf and held it up. "This is all the food I have left," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I know others are in the same situation. I know we are all hungry, but I was thinking that maybe if we pool whatever we have left, we can make sure everyone gets at least a little something." Starting with the children. For a moment, no one spoke. They just stared at her, at the loaf in her hands, and she felt a flush of embarrassment. Maybe this was foolish. Maybe she should have kept it for herself. But then Sarah Brennan stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "God bless you," Sarah whispered, and suddenly other people were moving, going back to their wagons and returning with whatever they could spare. A handful of cornmeal, a few strips of dried beef, half a jar of preserves, a small sack of rice. It was not much, not nearly enough, but it was something. It was hope. Zachariah had been checking the horses when he heard the commotion. He made his way to the center of the circle and stopped short when he saw what was happening. Maeve Callahan stood in the middle of the group, her face pale with cold and hunger, organizing the meager supplies into portions. She was giving away her last food, her last chance at survival, without hesitation. Something in his chest tightened as he watched her break her loaf into pieces, making sure each child got a share before any adults. He thought about all the people he had known in his 26 years, all the cowboys and ranchers and drifters who looked out only for themselves. He thought about his own father, a hard man who taught him that the world did not care about the weak, that only the strong survived. And here was this woman, alone and starving, giving away everything she had because she believed it was the right thing to do. He found himself walking toward her before he had made a conscious decision to move. She was handing a piece of bread to one of the Brennan children when he reached her side. "That was a brave thing you just did," he said quietly. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes, quickly hidden. "It was just bread," she said. "It was everything," he replied. She did not answer, just turned to give another piece to old Thomas Whitfield. But her hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. The supplies Maeve gathered that night were divided up and gone by the next morning. The storm showed no signs of breaking. On the 16th day, one of Sarah Brennan's children, a little boy named Matthew who was only 4 years old, developed a fever. Sarah sat up with him all night, trying to keep him warm, but by morning the fever had worsened. There was no doctor among them, no medicine. All they could do was pray and wait. Zachariah found Maeve sitting beside Sarah's wagon that afternoon, keeping watch while Sarah tried to rest. The little boy was sleeping fitfully, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored. "How is he?" Zachariah asked, crouching down beside Maeve. "Not good," she admitted. "The fever is getting worse." Without food to keep his strength up, without proper warmth, I do not know how long he can hold on. Zachariah was silent for a moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it to reveal a piece of dried venison about the size of his palm. His last food. "Give this to the boy," he said, holding it out to Maeve. "And tell Sarah to make it into a broth. It might help." Maeve stared at the meat, then at Zachariah. "This is your food. You need it. The boy needs it more. You will starve." "We are all starving," he said simply. "At least this way maybe one less person dies." She took the meat, her fingers brushing his again, and this time the touch lasted a moment longer. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, some understanding that went beyond words. Then she ducked into the wagon to give the meat to Sarah, and Zachariah stood and walked away before he could change his mind. That night, unable to sleep, Maeve thought about the cowboy who had given his last food to a dying child. She realized she barely knew anything about him. He was quiet, solitary, the kind of man who kept his thoughts to himself. But his actions spoke louder than any words. He had noticed when she gave away her bread. He had followed her example without hesitation. There was something solid about him, something trustworthy in a world that had become increasingly uncertain. The next morning, Matthew Brennan's fever broke. He was still weak, desperately weak, but he opened his eyes and asked for his mother, and everyone agreed it was a miracle. Sarah cried and thanked God and hugged her son close. And when she learned who had provided the meat that probably saved her boy's life, she sought out Zachariah and Maeve both, thanking them through her tears. "You gave when you had nothing to give," Sarah said, holding both their hands. "That is the truest kindness there is." After Sarah left, Maeve and Zachariah stood together in awkward silence. Finally, Maeve spoke. "Why did you do it? Give your food away like that?" Zachariah looked at her, really looked at her, and when he spoke his voice was rough with an emotion he could not name. "I saw you give away your last loaf without thinking twice. I guess I figured if you could do it, I could too. You shamed me into being a better man." "I did not mean to shame anyone," Maeve said quietly. "I just could not bear the thought of eating while children went hungry." "I know," Zachariah said. "That is what made it so powerful." They stood there a moment longer, the wind whipping around them, the snow falling in endless sheets. Then Zachariah did something he had not planned on doing. He reached out and took her hand. "We should probably stick together," he said. "Two people have a better chance of surviving than one. We can share body heat, share whatever resources we find, if you are willing." Maeve looked at his hand holding hers, rough and calloused and warm despite the cold. She thought about how alone she had felt since her father died, how the weight of survival had pressed down on her shoulders with relentless force. The idea of sharing that burden, even a little, was almost overwhelming. "I am willing," she said. From that day forward, they were rarely apart. Zachariah moved his bedroll to sleep under her wagon, providing an extra layer of protection from the wind. They took turns keeping watch, making sure her oxen did not freeze, venturing out together to gather whatever they could find. There was not much to find, just snow and ice and the occasional bit of bark stripped from trees, but having someone to search with made the task feel less hopeless. As the days passed and the storm continued its assault, they talked. In the quiet moments between the howling wind, huddled together for warmth, they shared their stories. Maeve told him about her father, about growing up poor but loved, about the dreams she had for California. Zachariah told her about his childhood on a ranch in Texas, about a father who was free with his fists and scarce with his affection, about the day he turned 16 and rode away without looking back. "I have been drifting ever since," he admitted one night, his voice low. "Never saw much point in settling down, never met anyone who made me want to." He did not say, "until now," but Maeve heard it anyway in the silence that followed. Her heart beat faster, and she turned to look at him in the dim light filtering through the canvas. "What changed?" she asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "I saw someone give away their last piece of bread," he said, meeting her eyes. "And I realized that maybe there was more to life than just surviving. Maybe there was something worth building, something worth staying for." Maeve felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. This was not the time for tears. This was the time for truth. "I am scared," she whispered. "I am so scared we are going to die out here, all of us. And I keep thinking about my father, about the promise I made him. I do not want to break that promise." Zachariah reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch impossibly tender. "You will not break it," he said with a certainty he did not entirely feel. "We are going to survive this. And when we get to California, I am going to help you build whatever life you want, if you will let me." "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you are brave and kind and stronger than anyone I have ever met. I know that when I look at you, I see something I have been searching for my whole life without knowing it. I know that if we make it through this, I do not want to drift anymore. I want to stay. With you." Maeve could not speak past the lump in her throat, so instead she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a soft kiss, hesitant and sweet, tasting of snow and desperation and hope. Zachariah wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close, and for a moment the cold and the hunger and the fear all faded away. There was just this, just the two of them, holding on to each other in the midst of a storm. When they finally pulled apart, Maeve rested her forehead against his and smiled. "I want that too," she said. "More than anything." They held each other through the night, sharing warmth and whispered dreams, and for the first time since the storm began, Maeve felt something other than fear. She felt hope. The storm finally broke on the 21st day. The wind died down to nothing, the snow stopped falling, and the sun emerged from behind the clouds like a blessing. People stumbled out of their wagons, blinking in the sudden brightness, hardly daring to believe it was real. Some laughed, some cried, and some just stood in silence, too exhausted to react. But the relief was short-lived. The damage the storm had wrought was staggering. More than half the livestock were dead, frozen where they stood. Several wagons had collapsed under the weight of the snow. And the people were in terrible shape. Gaunt and weak, their faces hollow with hunger, their bodies pushed to the very limits of endurance. Old Thomas Whitfield had died in the night, just hours before the storm broke. Two other people, a young couple named Peterson, had frozen to death in their wagon during the worst of the cold. Henry Polk called another meeting, his face grave. They needed to assess their situation and make a plan. The surviving families gathered once more, and this time the group was noticeably smaller. Polk did not waste time with pleasantries. "We lost good people," he said. "We lost most of our livestock. We lost supplies. But we are alive, and that counts for something. Now we need to figure out how to keep it that way." They had two choices, he explained. They could try to push forward through the mountains, though the snow was deep and the pass might be impassable. Or they could turn back try to make it to a settlement they had passed about 50 miles back, and wait out the rest of winter there. Both options were risky. Both might result in more deaths. The debate that followed was heated. Some families wanted to push forward, unwilling to give up on their dreams of California. Others wanted to turn back, prioritizing survival over ambition. Tempers flared, voices were raised, and for a moment it seemed like the group might split apart entirely. It was Zachariah who finally spoke up, his quiet voice cutting through the noise. "We are stronger together," he said. "Stronger as a group than we would be split up. Whatever we decide, we need to decide it as one. And we need to look out for each other, the way Miss Callahan looked out for all of us when she shared her last loaf. That kind of thinking is what is going to get us through this." People turned to look at Maeve, who felt her face flush. She had not expected to be held up as an example, had not thought her small act of kindness would be remembered in the midst of everything else. But she saw the nods, the murmurs of agreement, and realized that maybe it had mattered more than she knew. In the end, they voted to push forward. It would be difficult, maybe impossible, but most of the families felt that turning back would be admitting defeat, and they had come too far to give up now. Polk accepted the decision with a nod and began organizing the wagons for travel. The next few days were among the hardest of the entire journey. The snow was deep, sometimes up to the wagon axles, and progress was agonizingly slow. They had to double up teams on some wagons, using the surviving oxen and horses to pull multiple loads. People walked instead of riding, trying to lighten the burden on the animals. Zachariah and the other men took turns breaking trail, using shovels and their own bodies to clear a path through the drifts. Maeve walked beside her wagon, one hand on the side for balance, her breath coming in white puffs. Zachariah was ahead, helping to break trail, but he looked back frequently to check on her. Each time their eyes met, she felt that warmth in her chest, that sense of connection that had grown between them during the long nights of the storm. They made camp that first night having covered less than 3 miles. It was disheartening, but at least they were moving. At least they had not given up. Maeve helped to gather what little firewood they could find, her borrowed gloves protecting her hands from the worst of the cold. When Zachariah returned from his duties, his face was drawn with exhaustion, but he smiled when he saw her. "You look tired," she said, stating the obvious. "So do you," he replied, settling down beside her near the small fire they had managed to coax to life. She leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames dance, and then Maeve spoke. "You think we will make it?" "Yes," Zachariah said without hesitation. "We will make it." "How can you be so sure?" He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Because I have something to live for now," he said. "I have you." Maeve felt tears slide down her cheeks, but this time she did not try to hide them. She turned and buried her face in his shoulder, and he held her close while she cried out all the fear and grief and exhaustion of the past 3 weeks. When she finally stopped, when she pulled back and wiped her eyes, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I love you, Maeve Callahan," he said, the words coming out rough but true. "I did not plan on it, did not see it coming, but there it is. I love you." "I love you too," she whispered back, and saying it made it real, made it solid and unshakable. Whatever happened next, they had this. They had each other. The journey through the past took another week. A week of back-breaking labor, of cold that never seemed to ease, of hunger that gnawed at their bellies with relentless persistence. But slowly, painfully, they made progress. The snow began to thin as they descended the eastern slope of the mountains. The air grew warmer. And finally, Blessedly, they emerged from the pass and saw green valleys stretching out before them. The relief was almost overwhelming. People wept openly, thanking God and each other and whatever forces had seen them through. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. They made camp in a valley where the snow had melted and grass was starting to show through. The surviving livestock grazed hungrily, and people began to take stock of what they had left. It was not much, but it was enough. They could hunt now, could forage, could begin to rebuild their supplies. The worst was behind them. That night, Zachariah found Maeve sitting away from the camp, looking up at the stars. He sat down beside her and followed her gaze to the heavens. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "How close we came to dying, how many people we lost. How strange it is that something so terrible could bring something so good." "You mean us," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I mean us. I keep thinking that if the storm had not happened, we might never have spoken to each other. You would have stayed the quiet cowboy, I would have stayed the woman alone in her wagon, and we would have reached California as strangers." "I noticed you long before the storm," Zachariah admitted. "I just did not have the courage to do anything about it. Maybe the storm gave me that courage." Maeve turned to look at him, her expression serious. "What happens when we reach California?" she asked. "You said you were hired just for this journey. Will you move on to the next job, the next trail?" "Not if you do not want me to," he said. "I meant what I said back in the storm. I want to stay with you, I want to build a life with you, if that is what you want too." "It is," she said without hesitation. "But I have nothing to offer you, no money, no land, no prospects, just myself." Zachariah reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "That is all I need," he said. "That is everything." She leaned over and kissed him, a longer kiss this time, deeper and filled with promise. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her head on his shoulder and sighed contentedly. "Then we will build something together," she said. "Something good." They reached Ash Fork, Arizona 2 weeks later. It was a small settlement, barely more than a handful of buildings clustered around a trading post and a saloon, but to the weary travelers it looked like paradise. The wagon train stopped to resupply and rest, and many of the families decided to stay for a while, recovering their strength before continuing on. Zachariah and Maeve walked through the town together, hand in hand, discussing their options. California was still weeks away, and neither of them was in a hurry to get back on the trail. Ash Fork was growing, the locals said. There was opportunity here for people willing to work hard. "We could stay," Maeve said tentatively as they stood outside the trading post. "At least for a while. See if we can find work, save up some money before we move on." "Or we could stay for good," Zachariah said. "This place needs a decent stable. I know horses, I know how to build. We could start something here." Maeve looked around at the dusty street, the simple buildings, the wide open sky. It was not California, not the dream she had set out to find. But maybe, she thought, maybe the dream had changed. Maybe it was not about reaching a specific place anymore. Maybe it was about finding home wherever you could build it, with the person you loved by your side. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." They found a small plot of land on the edge of town that was for sale cheap. It had a run-down shack that would need significant work, but it also had a well and enough space to build a stable. Zachariah used the last of his wages from the wagon train as a down payment, and they moved in the next day. The shack was barely habitable, with gaps in the walls and a roof that leaked when it rained. But Maeve cleaned it out, swept the floors, and hung a curtain over the window, transforming it into something that felt like home. Zachariah spent his days working on repairs, patching the roof, filling in the gaps, building furniture from scrap wood he traded for at the settlement. It was hard work, exhausting work, but he went to bed each night with Maeve in his arms and woke each morning with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. Maeve found work at the trading post, helping the owner with inventory and serving customers. It did not pay much, but every penny counted. In the evenings, she would return to their little shack and cook whatever simple meal they could afford, and they would eat together and talk about their plans for the future. "We should get married," Zachariah said one night, the words coming out abruptly in the middle of a discussion about building plans for the stable. Maeve looked up from her plate, her eyes wide. "Is that a proposal?" she asked. Zachariah set down his fork and reached across the table to take her hand. "I know I should probably do this more proper," he said. "Get down on one knee, maybe have a ring to offer you. But I do not have a ring, and I figure you know me well enough by now to know that fancy speeches are not my strong suit. So I am just going to say it plain. I want to marry you, Maeve. I want you to be my wife. I want to build this life we have been talking about and spend every day making sure you never regret saying yes to me. Will you marry me?" Maeve felt tears spill over, but she was smiling so wide her face hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, they were both laughing, giddy with joy and relief, and the simple happiness of knowing they had found something real. They were married a week later by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Ash Fork. It was a simple ceremony with no guests other than the trading post owner and his wife, but Maeve wore a clean dress and wildflowers in her hair, and Zachariah wore his best shirt and looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zachariah kissed her with such tenderness that the trading post owner's wife cried happy tears. That night, in their little shack with its patched roof and rough walls, they consummated their marriage with a passion and tenderness that left them both breathless. Zachariah was gentle with her, patient and loving, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Maeve gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, and afterward they lay tangled together in their narrow bed, skin to skin, hearts beating in sync. "I never thought I would be this happy," Maeve whispered into the darkness. "I never imagined this kind of life was possible for someone like me." "Someone like you deserves all the happiness in the world," Zachariah murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you get it." True to his word, Zachariah worked tirelessly over the following months to build their stable. He started small, offering to board horses for travelers passing through Ash Fork, providing grooming and shoeing services. Word spread that he was good with horses, that he could gentle a wild Mustang and fix any problem a mount might have. Business grew steadily, and within 6 months they had enough money to start construction on a proper stable building. Maeve continued working at the trading post, but she also started a small garden behind their shack, growing vegetables to supplement their meals. She made friends with the other women in town, joining them for quilting circles and church socials. She was building a community, putting down roots in a way she never had before, and it felt good. It felt right. As autumn approached, Maeve realized she had not had her monthly courses in quite some time. At first she thought it was just stress, the aftermath of the terrible winter and the hard work of building a new life. But when the nausea started, when she found herself unable to stomach the smell of coffee in the morning, she knew. She was with child. She told Zachariah one evening after supper, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. He stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable, and she felt a flutter of fear. What if he was not ready? What if this was too much too soon? Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably carried clear across town. He swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing like a child. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "A baby, Maeve. Our baby." "You are happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," he said, setting her down gently and cupping her face in his hands. "I am over the moon. I am the luckiest man alive. We are going to be a family." Maeve burst into tears, but they were good tears, happy tears, and Zachariah held her close and rocked her gently until she stopped crying. That night, he was extra gentle with her, his hands reverent as they moved over her body, already protective of the life growing inside her. The pregnancy was not easy. Maeve suffered from terrible morning sickness in the first few months, and there were days when she could barely keep anything down. But Zachariah was attentive and patient, bringing her water and crackers, rubbing her back when the nausea got bad, never complaining about the extra work he had to take on when she was too ill to help. As winter approached again, Maeve found herself thinking about the wagon train, about the storm that had brought her and Zachariah together. It had been almost exactly a year since those terrible weeks trapped in the pass. So much had changed since then. She had gone from being alone and desperate to being married and building a life. She had a home, a husband who loved her, a child on the way. It seemed almost impossible that so much good could have come from so much suffering. Sarah Brennan came through Ash Fork that winter with her family, continuing their journey to California. She stopped by the stable to visit, and when she saw Maeve's swollen belly, she cried and hugged her tight. "Look at you," Sarah said, stepping back to beam at her. "Look at how far you have come. I am so happy for you." "How is Matthew?" Maeve asked, remembering the little boy who had been so sick during the storm. "He is wonderful," Sarah said. "Strong and healthy. I think about that storm sometimes, about how close we came to losing him. And I think about how you and Zachariah saved him with your kindness. I will never forget that." They visited for a while, catching up on news from the other families who had been on the wagon train. Some had settled along the way like Maeve and Zachariah. Others had pushed on to California. A few had not made it at all, succumbing to illness or accident on the continuing journey. It was sobering to hear, a reminder of how lucky they were. After Sarah left, Maeve stood in the doorway of their now much improved home and looked out at the stable, at the little town that had become theirs, at the life they had built. Zachariah came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, one hand resting on her belly. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How grateful I am," she said. "For everything. For you, for this place, for this life. Even for the storm in a strange way, because without it we might never have found each other." "I am grateful too," Zachariah said. "Every single day, I wake up grateful." Their son was born in early spring of 1878, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made the horses restless in the stable. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Zachariah feared he might lose Maeve. But she was strong, his wife, stronger than anyone knew, and when the baby finally came, she held him to her chest and wept with relief and joy. They named him Thomas, after the old man from the wagon train who had died just before the storm broke. It seemed fitting, a way to honor the past while looking toward the future. Thomas Turner came into the world with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination, squalling lustily and demanding attention from the moment he drew his first breath. Zachariah held his son with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the tiny life he had helped create. This was his child, his flesh and blood, a legacy that would continue after he was gone. The weight of that responsibility was staggering, but also thrilling. He looked at Maeve, exhausted but glowing in the bed, and felt his heart swell with a love so profound it almost hurt. "He is perfect," Zachariah said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are perfect. Thank you for this. Thank you for everything." "We made him together," Maeve said, reaching out to touch Zachariah's hand. "He is ours." The first year of Thomas's life was a blur of sleepless nights and constant work, but also profound joy. Maeve proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving even when exhausted. Zachariah doted on his son, carrying him around in a sling while he worked in the stable, talking to him constantly even though the baby was too young to understand. The stable business continued to grow, and they hired a young man named Peter to help with the workload. By the time Thomas was walking, Maeve was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter was born in the winter of 1879, small and quiet where her brother had been loud and demanding. They named her Ruth, after Maeve's mother, and she had her mother's red hair and her father's calm disposition. The years passed in a pattern of work and family, of building and growing. The stable expanded, adding a blacksmith shop and a small hotel for travelers. Ash Fork grew around them, more families settling, more businesses opening. Zachariah became a respected member of the community, known for his honesty and his skill with horses. Maeve was beloved by the townspeople, always the first to help when someone was in need, always ready with a kind word or a meal for those who had less. They had 2 more children, another son and another daughter, spacing them a few years apart. The house they lived in bore no resemblance to the rundown shack they had started with. Zachariah had rebuilt it entirely, adding rooms as the family grew, putting in real glass windows and a proper stone fireplace. There was a parlor with furniture Maeve had saved up for, and a kitchen with a real stove. It was a home filled with love and laughter, with children running through the rooms and the smell of baking bread always in the air. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachariah took Maeve on a rare evening walk without the children, leaving them in the care of their eldest, Thomas, who at 9 years old was already proving himself responsible beyond his years. They walked to the edge of town and stood looking out at the desert sunset, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. "You ever regret it?" Zachariah asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Staying here instead of going on to California, giving up on that dream?" Maeve turned to look at him, surprise on her face. "Not for a single moment," she said. "California was never really the dream. I thought it was, but I was wrong. The dream was this. A home, a family, someone to love who loves me back. I found all of that here with you. Why would I regret that?" Zachariah pulled her close and kissed her, a kiss that held 10 years of love and partnership and shared joy. "I fell in love with you during that storm," he said when they finally broke apart. "Watching you give away your last loaf of bread, seeing the kind of person you are. I knew then that I wanted to spend my life with you, and every day since has only made me more certain that I made the right choice. I fell in love with you when you gave away your last food to save Matthew," Maeve replied. "I saw your heart that day, and I knew it was the kind of heart I wanted to build a life with." They stood together as the sun set and the stars began to appear, and Maeve thought about that terrible winter, about the wagon train frozen in the pass, about the moment she decided to share her last loaf. It had been the hardest time of her life, but it had also been the beginning of everything good that had come after. Sometimes, she thought, the hardest moments revealed the most important truths. Sometimes suffering brought people together in ways nothing else could. As the years continued to pass, Zachariah and Maeve grew old together, watching their children grow and have children of their own. Thomas took over the stable when Zachariah's back finally gave out from decades of hard work. Ruth married a shopkeeper and opened a bakery in town. Their younger children found their own paths, building lives that made their parents proud. Zachariah and Maeve spent their final years sitting on the porch of their home, holding hands and watching the sun set each evening. They talked about the old days, about the wagon train and the storm, about all the people they had known and lost along the way. They talked about their children and grandchildren, about the legacy they were leaving behind. But mostly they just sat in comfortable silence, content in the knowledge that they had built something good, something lasting, something worth all the hardship it had taken to create it. Maeve died first, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73. Zachariah held her hand as she took her last breath, and he whispered that he loved her one final time. He buried her in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Ash Fork, under a stone that read, "Beloved wife and mother." He visited her grave every day, rain or shine, talking to her as if she could still hear him. Zachariah followed her less than a year later. His children found him on the porch one morning, his hand outstretched as if reaching for someone who was not there, a peaceful smile on his weathered face. They buried him next to Maeve, and the whole town turned out for the funeral, paying respects to a man who had helped build their community, and who had loved his wife with a devotion that became legendary. The story of Maeve and Zachariah became part of Ash Fork's history, passed down through generations. The tale of the woman who gave away her last loaf during the terrible blizzard of 1876, and the cowboy who noticed and fell in love. It became a story about kindness in the face of desperation, about love born from shared hardship, about building something beautiful from the ashes of suffering. Their children grew old telling the story to their own children and grandchildren. The stable that Zachariah built remained in the family for generations, eventually expanding into one of the largest horse trading operations in Arizona. The town grew around the legacy that Maeve and Zachariah had helped create, but their story remained at its heart, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the very best things, if only we have the courage to face them with kindness and keep our hearts open to love. In the end, it was not the reaching of California that mattered. It was not the gold or the promise of riches that made a life worthwhile. It was the small acts of kindness, the decisions made in moments of crisis, the connections forged in the midst of suffering. It was loving someone fully, building a life together one day at a time, and leaving behind a legacy of compassion and strength. Maeve Callahan Turner gave away her last loaf because she believed people should help each other, even when they had nothing left to give. Zachariah Turner noticed, and in noticing, found the love of his life. Together they built something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes, proving that the greatest wealth was not measured in gold or land, but in the love we share and the lives we touch along the way. And somewhere in the hills outside Ash Fork, under two simple stones weathered by time and wind, they rested together as they had lived, side by side, their love story complete and perfect and true. The blizzard that had frozen the wagon train for weeks had been the forge in which their love was tested and proven. And from that frozen hell had emerged a life more beautiful than either of them could have imagined when they first met on that desperate trail through the mountains. Their great-great-grandchildren still lived in Ash Fork, still ran the stable, still told the story of the blizzard and the bread and the cowboy who noticed. And every winter, when the snow fell and the wind howled through the mountain passes, the people of Ash Fork remembered Maeve and Zachariah Turner, and they were reminded that love could bloom even in the harshest conditions, that kindness was never wasted, and that sometimes the best things in life came not from reaching your destination, but from the journey itself and the people you met along the way. The stable still stood, rebuilt and expanded many times, but always on the same plot of land that Zachariah had first purchased with his last wages. The house still stood too, now a historical landmark that tourists came to visit, wanting to see where the famous story had taken place. Inside, preserved behind glass, was a simple wooden bowl that Maeve had used to mix her bread dough, the bowl that had held the last loaf she ever baked before the storm. It was a humble artifact, worn smooth by use, but to the people of Ash Fork it represented something profound. It represented sacrifice and love, the willingness to give everything for others, the kind of heroism that did not involve guns or glory but simple human decency in the face of impossible odds. And so the story lived on, generation after generation, a testament to the power of kindness and the enduring nature of true love. The blizzard had been terrible, yes, but it had also been transformative. It had stripped away everything superficial and revealed the truth of who people really were. And in that crucible of suffering, Maeve and Zachariah had found each other, had recognized in each other something precious and worth fighting for. They had started with nothing but determination and love, and from that foundation, they had built an empire of family and community that stretched far beyond their own lives. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried their blood and their values, spreading out across the territories, but always remembering where they came from, always remembering the story of the blizzard and the bread and the love that conquered everything. When the snow fell heavy in Ash Fork, when the wind howled and the temperature dropped and people huddled in their warm homes, they thought of Maeve and Zachariah out in that wagon train, trapped and starving and facing death with courage and compassion. And they were inspired to be better, to help their neighbors, to remember that they were all in this together, that community and kindness were what separated civilization from chaos. The trading post where Maeve had worked was long gone, replaced by modern buildings and paved streets. The circuit preacher who had married them had died decades ago. Most of the people who had been on that wagon train were forgotten, their names lost to time. But Maeve and Zachariah lived on in memory, their love story immortal, their example enduring. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy anyone could leave. Not wealth or power or fame, but a story that inspired others to be brave and kind and loving. A story that reminded people of what really mattered in life. A story that showed how love could grow in the most unlikely places, how hardship could forge bonds stronger than steel, how giving everything away could somehow lead to having more than you ever dreamed possible. Maeve Callahan Turner gave away her last loaf and found love. Zachariah Turner noticed and found purpose. Together they found a home, a family, a life worth living. And their story, born in the frozen hell of that mountain pass during the terrible winter of 1876, became a beacon of hope that shone down through the decades, lighting the way for all who came after, proving that even in the darkest moments, even when all seems lost, love and kindness can prevail. The wagon train that had been frozen for weeks eventually made it through the pass. Some families went on to California, others settled along the way. But none of them ever forgot those desperate days. None of them forgot the lessons they learned about survival and sacrifice, and the better angels of human nature. And when they told their own stories to their children, when they reflected on the journey west and all it had meant, they always came back to the moment when a young woman with nothing to her name gave away her last piece of bread, and a quiet cowboy noticed, and something beautiful and eternal was born. That was the story, That was the truth. That was the legacy of Maeve and Zachariah Turner, forever remembered, forever cherished, forever an example of what love could do when given the chance to grow even in the harshest soil. They had taken a moment of desperate generosity and transformed it into a lifetime of joy. They had taken notice of each other in the midst of chaos and built something calm and peaceful and good. They had proven that love was not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but about seeing someone truly, recognizing their worth, and choosing to stand beside them through whatever storms might come. And so their story ended where all good stories should, with love triumphant, with family thriving, with a legacy that would outlive them both and continue to inspire long after they were gone. The blizzard that froze the wagon train for weeks had been the beginning of their story, but love, real and true and deep, had been its middle and its end. And in a world that often seemed cold and harsh and unforgiving, that was a story worth telling, a story worth remembering, a story worth passing down through the generations so that no one would ever forget what was possible when kindness met courage, when sacrifice met notice, when two lonely souls found each other in the midst of a storm and decided to build something that would last forever.